Welcome back to another episode of Watching the Meta, the weekly series where I take my face, put it in a pie chart, and we take a look and see what the heck everybody played over the weekend in the Magic Online challenges. We take a look and see what the top 32 metagame breakdown looks like, and at the very end of each individual format segment, we take a look and see if we can find some spicy deck lists littered amongst the top 32. Now, because this is the first weekend where Edge of Eternities was available on Magic Online, we are going to be only looking at deck lists featuring Edge of Eternities cards, and it just so happened to be that there is a lot of them. There's a lot of new cards being played across all three different formats that we cover here: Modern, Pioneer, and Standard. Before we get started, I just wanted to say thank you all for supporting the channel ever since we've been doing this. I've had a lot of people come up and tell me that they love the weekly metagame series. I read all of your comments in the comment section down below, so thank you for doing that. If you enjoy this type of content, please consider subscribing to the channel, drop a like, and let me know in the comment section down below what's your favorite card from Edge of Eternities. Could be any format, even Commander. I'll even appease to the Commander players this week. But with all of that out of the way, let us get started as we always do with Modern. And Modern is, it's got a Modern. It's still the Modern format. It's Modern. You're not surprised to see it's Modern. So Boros Energy, roughly still about the same. It is the top dog in the format, I guess, as it were. 16.1% last week. Slight uptick to 17.1%. Domain Zoo, again, similar thing. Slight uptick. Orzhov Blink went down pretty significantly from 6.7 to 2.2. But that's because a lot of the Orzhov players switched to Esper, and we'll get into why they did that in the decklist section in just a minute. Brood Scale down a little bit from 6.3 to 3.1. Everything else is mostly pretty much the same. Neobrand, Ruby Storm, Oculus. I will say Affinity went from 2.7 to 4.9. There's some new cards in the Affinity decks. Again, we'll get to that in a second. Esper Blink, that is the huge difference here, was basically non-existent last week, and now it is the second most played deck. So we'll definitely be taking a look at one of those Esper deck lists, and then you see the rest of the metagame shaking out as it were. I will say there's been a slight uptick in Jeskai Scam. I'm not going to be covering the deck list because there wasn't any Edge of Eternities cards, but when I say Scam, you could call it Jeskai Control, but it's basically the version that's playing with 4 Flage, 4 Null Drifter to pair with 4 Dress Down and 4 Consigned to Memory. So that has seemed to have been the more popular version of Control compared to typical Jeskai Control that's trying to play more of a longer game. So keep that in mind. I would guess the heavy Flage version is maybe a little bit better into Boros because you just turbo out of Flage and hope they can't kill it. So that is what the metagame looks like. Again, it's Modern, pretty similar, some slight changes, and I think, again, Esper Blink, the most notable one here. But that's enough of the metagame. Let's take a look and see what people brought to the table with the new cards. And the first deck we have for you here is from Medevdev in 12th place. Now, when I said Affinity is starting to play the new cards, I really did mean it. 4 copies of Pinnacle Emissary featured in this deck list. Pinnacle Emissary is a card that I've had my eye on in Standard, but it just doesn't quite make the cut because there aren't enough cheap artifacts. This is a card that you can warp for a single mana, and then the turn that you warp it for a single mana, if you can play a bunch of 1 or 0 mana artifacts, you make a whole army of 1/1s, and that's really good because when you're playing with affinity cards like Kappa Cannoneer, which doesn't have affinity, but it has honorary affinity, and this version is actually not playing Thought Monitor, they're playing Thoughtcast instead, but Emery and some more affinity cards. But the high density of zeros like Mishra's Bauble, Mox Opal, and Mox Amber gives you some really explosive turns with Pinnacle Emissary. And you have that one big pop-off turn where you warp it for 1 mana, and then on the following turn, it's still just good as a 3-mana 3/3 that's still going to make tokens, especially because the turn that you do it, you're probably playing a couple baubles, you sack the baubles, draw more cards, and that gives you more stuff to cast in the next turn. So it does make a lot of sense for like more traditional affinity decks to go towards Pinnacle Emissary. Yet to be determined if it's better than Cori-steel Cutter, but time will tell. As we talked about earlier, Esper Blink, huge uptick. And the reason for that is this card that you see on your screen in front of you here, Quantum Riddler. This is a very, very powerful warp card from Edge of Eternities. And I know there was a lot of conversation from people when they first saw the warp mechanic. Are any of these going to be even remotely playable in Modern? Because there's so many more ways to blink in Modern and much more efficiently. Stuff like Flicker Wisp, stuff like Ephemerate, you have a lot more, and Felia as well. You have a lot more ways to kind of reset your creatures. And it seems that Riddler is the most powerful one because for 2 mana, you get a huge flyer, 4/6. You can draw extra cards if you're Hellbent, if you can somehow dump your hand, which it doesn't seem like you would be able to, but with something like Solitude, you actually kind of can dump your hand pretty quickly if you start pitching cards to Solitude. Like, I can imagine a world where you maybe like Fatal Push their first thing, play Ophelia. Next turn, you go like, play my land, Solitude, pitch, play my Riddler, and then maybe you have 1 card left over because you pitched a card to Solitude, attack with the Ophelia, blink the Riddler, comes back, draw 2, you get a 4/6 flyer. So there's some really cool stuff you can do with the Riddler. And then you still have the powerful like Felia Overlord draws, same thing with Flicker Wisp. The Riddler is also another big thing to get back with Emperor of Bones, because before you really only had Overlord as like a huge threat to get back off of Bones. So that's kind of cool as well. So yeah, this has been definitely the more popular version of Blink, and I think for good reason. The Riddler seems very powerful. Slightly different take on the Affinity deck list from Suktler in 16th place. Now, I didn't quite know what to label this as. I labeled it on my spreadsheet as Jeskai Prowess, but it really is more of like a hybrid between Prowess and Affinity. I decided to call it Prowess because there's no actual Affinity cards here. There's no Thought Monitors, Kappa Cannoneers, Thoughtcast, any of that stuff. But basically the concept is you still have this kind of core of Pinnacle Emissary to make a bunch of 1/1s. You pair that with Mox Opal and Mishra's Bauble. And then your threats are Monastery Swiftspear, Astrologian's Planisphere, and Cori-steel Cutter. Now, Planisphere and Cutter are both artifacts that trigger Emissary, and they're also artifacts that pay you off for playing more cheap spells. So you kind of have this sort of package deal of Planisphere, Cutter, Emissary pairing really nicely with Mishra's Bauble and Mox Opal. It's unfortunate that because we're not playing Affinity, we don't really have room to play Emry and Tameo, so Mox Amber is sort of off the table. I wish there was another 0-mana artifact. Like, do you ever consider just playing Welding Jar as a 0-mana artifact that like maybe regenerates a Planisphere or Cutter? Probably not. But in any case, then you still have like what also the Affinity stuff lets you play something like Galvanic Blast as your additional removal spell as a really nice complement to Lightning Bolt, and then the usual Expressive Iteration and Preordain. So interesting looking list. Not sure I actually like this version better than the Affinity version that we looked at, but definitely something to think about. And let's not forget, there was an Eldrazi in this set, so naturally people are going to try putting it in Eldrazi-tron. So Peter H. Masters, 13th place in one of the challenges this weekend, has put 4 copies of Anti-Causal Vestige into Eldrazi-tron. This card is nice because it's actually kind of awkward with Tron, right? Where the Vestige sort of, because of its warp ability that says when it leaves the battlefield, you draw a card and then put a permanent from your hand onto the battlefield with mana value less than or equal to the number of lands you control. When you're cheating on mana with Tron, you actually have much less options, right? Like, for example, if you go Tron, Vestige on turn 3, and your opponent kills it, you only have 3 lands in play, so you can't put any of your big stuff into play. You can still put a Trinisphere into play, which is kind of nice, because you do have 3 lands on the battlefield there. But, like, none of your Devourer, Sire, Ulamog, that stuff can't come into play. Karn as well, if you're playing the Vestige on turn 3, so it's a little awkward. But it can ramp you, right? Because you can also put lands into play with the Vestige. So they kill it, you could even just warp it, put another land into play, and then that gives you enough mana to like Ulamog or Karn plus Big Thing next turn. So there's definitely something here for sure, but just keep in mind that Tron is maybe not the best way to sort of utilize a card like Anti-Causal Vestige. Now with Modern out of the way, let us go ahead and take a look at Pioneer, and it's Pioneer. That's Pioneer. That sure looks like Pioneer to me. I feel like we've had the exact same format for the past month and a half now, which is not necessarily a bad thing. Mono Red Mice, maybe a little bit higher percentage share than we'd like at 25.6. It seems to be about in that 25% range consistently over the past couple of weeks. Rakdos Demons, basically the same. Is it Phoenix? Roughly exactly the same. Scapeshift, a little bit of a downtick. Celestia Angels basically just completely fell off the face of the earth. 7% last week, non-existent. You see that little green sliver between Scapeshift and Azorius Control? The metagame share is so small that my editor couldn't even put the number on the screen. Azorius Control, slight uptick. Orzhov Monument, about the same. One thing I do want to mention, Azorius Spirits, 0.6% last week, 7.5% this week. And I went through all of the Azorius Spirit deck lists. We're not going to be featuring one on the section that we talk about next. The only new card they're playing, and it is a big one, is Seam Rip. So, I mean, the thing is, we already had Portable Hole and Pioneer, so I don't really know if that's much of an upgrade per se. I think it's just the fact that they get to play more copies of it, because most of the lists that I saw were playing Portable Hole and Seam Rip. So maybe a little bit more redundancy on the cheap removal spells is good. But for the most part, they weren't playing any other new cards. Sacrifice, Golgari Sacrifice, 4.4%. Roughly about the same. Some small changes between Creativity and Junsac. Boros Hammer, a little bit of a downtick. But for the most part, it's the Pioneer that you know and love and you would come to expect. But that's not what you're here for. You're here for the spice. And there was a lot of it this week. The first deck list I want to highlight here from Hernan72 in 31st place is it In Soul? Now, Is It In Soul got a couple of new upgrades from the set. The most notable is, honestly, probably Nutrient Block, where this does have an ability you can sacrifice it to draw a card, but you're mostly just playing this as a 1-mana artifact that is indestructible, which pairs nicely with Darksteel Citadel to give you more redundancy on the draws where you can ensoul an indestructible artifact to turn it into a 5/5. Because now you have a 5/5 that remains indestructible. And because of this, now that we have Nutrient Block and Darksteel Citadel, it makes a card like Zoetic Glyph a little bit more appealing. Because before, only having Citadel, maybe you wouldn't want to play Glyph, but now that you have two indestructible things, that makes this card a little bit better. The other new card that I want to talk about here is Caveron Harrier. This is a 1-drop. Whenever you attack with it, you can pay 2 mana to put a 2/2 robot into play tapped and attacking, and you sack the robot at end of turn. This is nice because it's a good standalone threat. Other than in Soul Artifact, you were kind of missing that sort of like card post, like a card that you could play post Wrath that gave you a good amount of battlefield presence. And now with Caveron Harrier, you kind of have that in the form of also being an artifact that you can either ensoul or equip or sacrifice to Shrapnel Blast. So a little bit of some upgrades there. Also, Mockingbird on Harrier is kind of nice because if you Mockingbird the Harrier and now it has flying, it's harder to block. So if your opponent plans on blocking the Harrier, it's going to be harder to do that when you have a flying version of it. So that's kind of cool. But yeah, really interesting looking deck list. I really like the Nutrient Block. I don't love it in Standard as much because you only have Glyph and you don't have Ensoul, but certainly something to think about in Pioneer. Next up from S. Pyromancer in 22nd place, we have Jund Sacrifice. And the card that we're going to be talking about here is Biotech Specialist. This is a card that, at red and green, when it comes into play, you make a lander token, and whenever you sacrifice an artifact, you deal 2 damage to target opponent. Now, this is pretty nice because when you're going through Witch's Oven plus Cauldron familiar loops, each time that you're doing that, you're sacrificing the food to bring back the familiar, which domes your opponent for an additional 2 damage with the Biotech Specialist. Also, something like Gilded Goose, something simple as just sacrificing a food for mana, also triggers Biotech. You have Scavenger's Talent, which makes a bunch of food, Deadly Dispute that you can sacrifice artifacts to, Fable makes treasures. Now, you still have the Yigra Eater of All plus Double Cauldron Familiar combo, which you don't need the Biotech in play for, but it does open up some additional just like ways to sort of chip shot out your opponent, because as you may know, Jund Sacrifice, deck that is very good at just dealing incremental points of damage. And when you're taking all of those incremental points and slapping 2 onto them, you can kind of see how it's pretty easy to kill them from a relatively high life total. So Biotech is definitely something that I'm interested in these sacrifice decks, and looks pretty good. But how about if we took the green out of the Jund deck? That is what Tyabel X did in 22nd place here. So this is Rakdos Sacrifice. Now, we have a different 2-mana card here. Instead of playing Biotech Specialist, we are playing Weapons Manufacturing. This is an enchantment that says whenever a non-token artifact enters the battlefield under your control, you make a munitions token. The munitions token can't be sacrificed to itself. There's no sacrifice ability, but it says when it leaves the battlefield, you deal 2 damage to any target, not just opponents. So, when you pair it with a bunch of cheap artifacts like Experimental Synthesizer, Implement of Combustion, Oni Cult Anvil, Clockwork Percussionist, things like that, you have some very easy ways and very cheap ways to make a bunch of munitions token, and then you can sacrifice them to the greatest Magic the Gathering card of all time, Rottenmouth Viper. That's kind of our big sack outlet where we have a whole bunch of munitions in play. That's our way to like sacrifice them all at once. I wouldn't mind seeing something like a couple copies of Umbral Collar Zealot in here just as an additional sacrifice outlet. I believe ATOG is also legal in Pioneer. Somebody can fact check me in the comment section. I'm pretty sure it was reprinted at some point, but that could be something. And then you have stuff like Deadly Dispute, Shrapnel Blast, Torch the Tower. These are ways to sacrifice just one at a time. You can also Gleeful Demolition, the munitions token, which then gives you 3 more bodies to sacrifice to Rottenmouth Viper. Oni Cult Anvil can also, again, sacrifice those extra munitions, but only one at a time, so it's a little bit slower. But yeah, Weapons Manufacturing does seem like it puts a lot of work in this list, and definitely something to think about. Maybe even a list that has both Weapons Manufacturing and Biotech Specialist. And last up here from Elenir in 31st place, this one doesn't have a ton of new cards, but I did kind of want to highlight this because I have this card pegged as one of my standouts from Edge of Eternities, and I really still think this card is not getting as much credit as it deserves. Sunset Saboteur. So 4/1 Menace for 2 mana, unbelievable stat line. Ward, discard a card, so even if, yes, it's a little flimsy, it dies to a lot of different removal spells, but if they kill it, you're going to get a 2-for-1 out of it. And whenever it attacks, you put a +1/+1 counter on target creature an opponent controls. So if they don't have a creature in play, there's no downside. And the idea is that if they have 2 things in play, it's unlikely they can make a profitable double block that early, so the counters don't matter too much. You can also just put a counter on like a Llanowar Elf or something, and then they're not going to want to block with it anyways. But just some mono black stuff: Demons, Archfiend, Unholy Annex, Push, Go for the Throw, Thoughtseize, the usual mono black stuff. Just wanted to show you a deck list with Sunset Saboteur because I really like that card, and I think it's pretty cool. So with Pioneer out of the way, let us get to what I perceive to be probably the most important segment of this video, Standard. And here it is, Edge of Eternity's Week 1 Standard. Funny enough, the top 3 decks didn't really change that much. Dimir went actually up from 20 to 22. Izzet Prowess went from 16.9 to 11.5, and Cauldron stayed roughly about the same from 16.3 to 15.6. So the top 3 decks in the format, really not changing that much. Some people could argue it's the top 2 decks because it's just Dimir and Izzet. I give a little bit of pushback because the 2 Izzet decks are extremely different from each other. If you look at the deck lists, they really only share 4 non-land cards, and it's the VVs. Basically, everything else is the same. I guess the Prowess deck plays 1 Cauldron, but I digress. The rest of this is really where we want to take a look here. So Golgari mid-range last week, 8.8%. Roots was 4.4 last week, 0.5 this week. Well, unfortunately, we lost Tyvar, so that kind of makes sense. One really big increase that I want to talk about, and we will take a look at a deck list because it did win a challenge, Esper Pixie. A lot of people thought this deck was going to be dead. They banned 2 cards from it, Hopeless Nightmare and This Town Ain't Big Enough. Still here, baby. Well, we'll take a look at some new cards because there's definitely a new card in the Pixie deck that I think makes it potentially quite a bit better than it was before. Mono Red Aggro, 3.1% last week. Trying to find it. I can't even see it on the thing last week. So people still playing Mono Red, even with the rotation of Swift Spear and the banning of Heartfire and Monstrous Rage. Boros Mice, 4.7. Simic Aggro, which is not the most descriptive deck name, but we'll take a look at that one because that one is a pretty sweet one. You're going to like that. Naya Yuna, Orzhov Token. So yes, the top 3 decks are roughly still the same, and they probably occupy the same, if not slightly more of a metagame share. But the rest of the format is where basically everything changed. Now, I will say, of the 6 challenges, 4 of them were won by Izzet, 1 of them was won by Demir, so, you know. But anyways, let's take a look and see if we can find some spicy deck lists that maybe don't have Vivi in them. The first one I want to highlight here from Matt B in 23rd place. This is the Temur Battlecrier combo deck. Now, this version that you see on your screen is significantly different than the version that I personally have been playing and loving quite a bit. I'm more of a believer of playing a bunch of the clones, not actual clone, but Visage Bandit and Mirror Room, and I also have 4 copies of Devastating Onslaught. I think this is one of the best cards in the entire deck, and a huge upgrade to this deck from Edge of Eternities. What's really nice about Devastating Onslaught is that when you have Temur Battlecrier in play, you get a massive, massive discount on it, because for every 2 4-power creatures you have, you get 1 more copy for free. So for example, if you have 4 creatures in play that are 4 or more power, and you have 1 mana floating or 1 mana untapped, you can still Devastating Onslaught to make 2 copies of your Outcast or Trailblazer. To give you a rundown, the combo is you basically just get Battlecrier and Trailblazer into play, and then at least this version is a little bit different because, again, they're not playing the clone, so you can't keep cloning the Trailblazer over and over again. They play stuff like Roaming Throne to double up the Trailblazer triggers and Anti-Causal Vestige. What's nice about Vestige and Roaming Throne is they are free spells because, remember, Battlecrier discounts all of your spells by a colorless mana. If you have a colorless creature that happens to have 4 power, you can just play it for free. So the Throne you can cast for free, double up on Trailblazer triggers. Eventually you get to a spot where you have 1 mana left over, you onslaught your Trailblazer, make some red mana, play Dragonhawk, kill your opponent. The reason I don't like this version as much is you draw so many cards that, like, there's actually some spots where if you've drawn too many cards before you can find the way to make the extra mana, you don't have enough cards in deck sometimes to kill them with Dragonhawk, so I prefer Recruiter as a win condition, but I can understand the differences between both versions. But just kind of wanted to showcase this to you because Vestige and Onslaught, huge new upgrades for this deck. I mean, we can't forget about Breeding Pool and Stomping Ground too, but really good looking deck list, and one that I might be considering for the upcoming Spotlight Series in Orlando. Another deck that I am definitely considering for the Orlando tournament is Esper Pixie, and this is kind of what it looks like in its new form. This is the challenge winning list from Morta. This is basically the same list that everybody's been playing. I think it might have been Claudio that posted the list first or did well with the list, and then everybody just kind of copy pasted it from there. So it is playing 4 copies of Cosmogrand Zenith. This is a fantastic card from Edge of Eternities. Whenever you play your second spell, you can either make 2 1/1s or put a +1/+1 counter on each creature you control. So it allows you to go very wide. And once you have 1 or 2 flyers in play, something like Fear of Isolation, Nurturing Pixie, or Sun Pearl Kirin, or even Spyglass Siren for that matter, you can just put a counter on all of your flyers and go to town from there. 4 Stormchasers talent, 4 stock up. Love this. I think earlier versions didn't have the full 4 stock ups, but one thing that I quickly realized is that I just didn't have enough spells for talent, and I also love the Tragic Trajectories here. You are kind of missing a good cheap 1 mana kill spell, and Trajectory is nice because it's very easy to trigger when you have stuff like Pixie, Sun Pearl Kirin, even Spyglass Siren turns on Void, and it's a 1 mana kill most of the things that you can get back with Stormchaser's talent. And then also, we can't understate how important having 8 Shocklands is for a deck like this. So definitely something that is on my mind. I'm not sure I'm a believer in the full 4 Cosmogrand Zenith because you don't really want to draw 2 copies. So I might consider cutting one of those for maybe a main deck Kaido, but overall, very clean looking deck list and something that is certainly on my radar. Let's talk about some Simic, huh? Hamuda has been playing this deck a lot. I believe they had 3 different challenge placings over the weekend. One was 8th, one was top 16, and I think one was top 4. So pretty good showing for 3 different challenges with this Simic aggro. I don't really know what to call this, but in any case, it's a really, really sweet looking deck list. So the idea here is you are really just like a Simic beatdown deck, Simic tempo maybe, where you have Llanowar Elf into some good 3s like Sentinel, the Nameless City, and Paw Patch Recruit. I know it looks like a 1, but it's basically a 3-drop. What I love about Paw Patch is how good this card is against Dimir. When you go turn 1 Elf into turn 2 Paw Patch, it's so hard for them to, like, every single spell they play, you're just going to get 2 counters over and over again. Couple of new cards to highlight here, Gene Morph and Mago. It's kind of weird to see this in a deck that doesn't have fetch lands like Fabled Passage and Escape Tunnel and things like that. But even if you're not triggering it multiple times in the same turn, just a 2-mana 1/3 flyer that has the ability to be a 3/3 flyer for a couple of turns is sometimes just good enough. And then it's also a cheap flyer for something like Enduring Curiosity. You have Flood Pits Drowner to kind of... This deck, being Simic, you don't have a ton of good interaction. Well, you do have 4 Into the Flood Maws, which may be the best removal spell in Standard, but you do need a little bit of ways to kind of sort of play on your opponent's turn and just kind of interact more with their creatures. So I like the Flood Pits Drowner. And then topping out the curve, we got some Ouroboros, which is pretty interesting because you can put counters on the Ouroboros with something like Spyglass Siren. So you can map onto it, and then that gives you 2 counters on your whole team. Even like Paw Patch Recruit, where you can put a counter on the Ouroboros and then trigger it on your turn. 2 copies of Hemosymbic Might, which again, similar card you want to pump with stuff like Ouroboros and Paw Patch Recruit. And yeah, 4 Into the Flood Maws, some lands, couple of creature lands like Soulstone and Vinestock. Again, I'm not really sure what to call this. I called it Simic Aggro because it feels like an aggressive deck. But in any case, one that I kind of want to spend some time on. I like the way this looks, and the addition of Breeding Pool certainly makes this a lot better, where it seems like you have some more things to do with your... You can be a little bit more flexible in your mana base. So, love the way this deck looks, and probably going to have to give it a try for myself. And last but not least, we are going to end today's video off with some Kona Rescue Beastie. This is a card that I think a lot of people had their eyes on when the station mechanic was spoiled with various planets and spaceships, and the idea is that you have a lot more consistent ways to tap the Kona. Before, we only really had like Lumbering World Wagon, you had to get kind of creative and play Thundering Velocipede, and there were some weird vehicles you could play, but now you can kind of just do it in your mana base. So this list is playing 4 Avendo and 4 Susur. For the most part, you're not really ever going to get the 12, so you can kind of ignore the text at the very bottom line of text. But they are ways to tap your Kona. That's the important part. And then when you have the Kona tapped, you get to, in your second main phase, put any permanent from your hand onto the battlefield. So you can cheat out something like Galta Stampede Tyrant, Summon Bahamut, Ureni, Valgavoth, Vaultborn Tyrant. And what's nice about this is with Archdruid's Charm not only allows you to tutor for the Kona, so if you have, say, for example, Avendo, you go Avendo, Forest, turn 3 Charm, turn 4 Kona, tap the Kona, you're good to go. Archdruid's Charm can also be a way to find your payoff, right? If you already have the Kona, you can just go search up a Summon, a Ureni, or a Valgavoth, or a Tyrant, and you're good to go from there. And then lastly, this deck also has kind of this weird Zombify angle where you're playing 4 Bitter Triumph to discard and then 2 Cynical Loner, which also has the survival mechanic that says, beginning of your second main phase, if it's tapped, you can search for any card and put it into your graveyard. So you can go like turn 1 Susur, turn 2 Loner, tap the Loner, and second main phase bin a big creature, and then set up for a Zombify on turn 4. So really cool looking deck list. There's a lot going on here, but a lot to like about this. Not sure about playing 4 Susur with 4 Archdruid's Charm. You may have to change the mana base a little bit there, but in any case, really cool looking deck list from WCL. And that's going to do it. Folks, that is going to do it for another episode of Watching the Meta. I really hope you guys enjoyed this one. First week with Edge of Eternities. Let me know in the comment section down below, what was your favorite deck that was covered on today's episode, and we'll do it all again next week, all right? Thank you all for watching, and I'll see you next time.